Yes, Ms. Richards.
Mr. Waters, I'm going to ask you next to look at some Executive Committee minutes from the 7th of February 1985. Seamus, it's HSOC 0029476_045, please. If we look at the top of the page, we'll see the date, 7th of February 85. And if we go over the page, please, Seamus. If we look at the top of the page, please, Mr. Waters, it says this: AIDS, the coordinator introduced a discussion on AIDS under the following headings. A, the apparent lack of direction from reference centres to centres and associate centres. B, the varied and uncoordinated approaches by centres to the present situation, stressing in particular the difficulties caused by A and B in dealing with inquiries from members. C, the lack of confidentiality from hospital staff with personal details about AIDS patients being apparently freely available. So, Mr. Waters, there are clearly a number of concerns there that the Society has identified from somewhere. Are you able to assist any further with what those concerns were or where the Society was hearing this from?
We would be hearing it from members who were attending reference centres and associate centres. That would be our principal source of information.
I think lack of confidentiality probably speaks for itself. Do you recall any more about what the issue was in terms of lack of direction or uncoordinated approaches?
No.
And then if we could look at the bottom of the next page, please, Seamus. If we look at the very bottom of the page, this is in relation to grant applications, and we can see applications having been made by Dr. Tedder and Dr. Mortimer, supported, it would appear, by reference centre directors, for assistance with funding for their work relating to ongoing testing for HTLV3 positivity. And if, well, I don't think we need to go over the page, but the recommendation was that the grant should be made. Do you have any recollection as to why it was this important work being undertaken by Dr. Tedder and Dr. Mortimer was not being sufficiently funded centrally, such that they had to make an application to a charitable organisation for assistance?
I've no recollection, but I remember being fairly shocked at the time, as indeed I am now.
I'm going to ask you to look next at the Hemofact from May of 1985. Seamus, it's DHSC 301268, please. You'll see the date, Mr. Waters, bottom of the page, 22nd of May 1985, Hemofact number 7. And if we could go over the page, please, Seamus. We can see in the first paragraph on the left-hand side, as in the first paragraph of the main text, all the evidence now points to the fact that virtually all haemophilia patients who have received large pool plasma products, e.g. concentrates, within the past 5 years have been exposed to the putative agent of AIDS, HTLV3. Now that's a fairly huge acknowledgement or fact, Mr. Waters, that society now understands and is explaining that virtually all patients receiving concentrates have been exposed to the agent of AIDS. Can you recall whether that led to any discussions or soul searching within the society about whether the course that had previously been taken by the society had been the right one?
Again, I go back to my oft-quoted statement. We acted on the basis of the information we had available to us at the time from Haemophilia Centre Directors Association or organisation, our own medical advisory panel, and the Department of Health.
No,
this was a mind-changing moment, really. And I noticed that the content came from the World Hemophilia AIDS Center in Los Angeles, and is authored by Shelby Dietrich.
I understand what you say, Mr. Waters, about where the Society had got its advice and information from, and I understand what you say about this being a mind-changing moment. My question was a slightly different one. This being, as you describe it, a mind-changing moment, can you recall whether, as a matter of fact, there were discussions or soul-searching exercises of some kind within the Society to look back at how the Society had perhaps not got things right? Was this consciously grappled with?
It wasn't really a question of the Society not getting things right. The Society acted on the basis of the information it received. And of course it was a matter of regret. It remains a matter of regret to this day that we were ill-advised. And of course, we had already by now, I think if we're being sequential, arrived at the point where heat-treated products were available and coming on stream. And of course, it created soul-searching.
And do you recall whether there came any point at which the Society thought said to itself, as it were, we've been badly advised and we're going to take up that issue with Haemophilia Reference Centre directors or the Department of Health to say, why didn't you give us more information? Did that point come?
I think the point of that long view was not then.
Okay.
We were under so much pressure. I cannot overemphasize the pressure we worked under.
Okay. And then if we just look further down the document, it said in the next paragraph, individual interpretation of the results of the test on any given patient is not an indication of AIDS. At the moment, the potential value is scientific. We would urge those who feel able to do so to continue to cooperate with their doctors in such tests. And that message is repeated later in the same document. Do you recall whether there was any particular issue that the Society was aware of patients not wanting to be tested, or is this just a reproduction of something that had been produced by the World Haemophilia AIDS Centre?
It was a direct reproduction of something produced by WFH AIDS Centre.
Can we then please look at...
There was a very real issue that people were being tested without knowing they'd been tested.
Yes, and it may be that we come to some discussion of that. If not, I will ask you about that in the course of the morning. I hope, Mr. Waters. Can we look at PRSE 302619? This is bulletin number 2 of 1985, and you'll see under the heading New Funds to Fight AIDS, £90,000 for reference centres. It says the 6 English haemophilia reference centres have been given £90,000 by the DHSS as part of new funds provided to fight AIDS. The £90,000 is earmarked for counselling. On top of this, the Haemophilia Society gets £32,000. These new funds have been described as a one-off payment. Now, this is recording what we've seen from other documents, payments to the reference centres as a one-off for assistance with counselling. As this records, this is just the 6 English reference centres. Do you recall whether the Haemophilia Society was involved in any lobbying to try and secure equivalent payments to any Scottish, Welsh or Northern Irish centres or any English non-reference centres?
I have no recall of that at all.
Then if we go...
Could I see the banner on the top of that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was just verifying where we were and what our staffing levels were at that time.
And then if we go, please, to PRSC 301207... this is Hemofact AIDS release number 9, 24th of September 1985. And if we go over the page, we can see there set out in the Hemofact some headlines, in particular, I think, relating to the position of children in schools. And if we go to the next page, we can see their reference to recent publicity in Hampshire, and then we can see that the Hemofact sets out this. We want to let you know our position on the question of HTLV3 antibody status as it affects both children and adults with haemophilia. And then there is reference to status being private, this being confidential medical information. And if we go to the bottom of the page, you can see at point 3, you say decision about disclosing your antibody status is entirely up to you. We advise against sharing this information with anyone outside your immediate family, apart from your local authority, medical staff, or at your own discretion and in absolute confidence, the head teacher at your child's school. Now, I just wanted to, really, through the vehicle of this document, ask you to explain to us what the Society was learning from its members at this time about the issues set out here, the release of confidential information, and the impact that was having upon members.
I mean, most people had never withheld information about their involvement with haemophilia and everything else. And the great British public were very quick to put 2 and 2 together and make 6 and decide that every child with haemophilia must have HIV. Kids were being excluded from school. And as I described earlier, homes were being tampered with and interfered with. And while we left disclosure as a matter for the individuals, we did advise against it, just in view of everything that was coming our way. We had hate telephone calls, awful messages left on the answering machine, and that was nothing to us compared to what it was to the families who were receiving abuse in the community.
We can take that down. Before we look at one further document from 1985, can I then pick up on something you said a few minutes ago, Mr. Waters? You referred to the issue of patients being tested for HTLV3 without their consent. Is this right? Is that something that the Society became aware of
yes.
in the course of the 1980s?
But both in terms of live testing and in retrospective testing of stored serological samples.
And can you recall, again, you may not be able to, but can you recall what action, if any, the Society took as a society on those issues?
We most certainly raised it with the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation and our medical advisors as an issue that could be open to litigation in due course.
And that was something that was being raised with you by your members, was it?
Indeed, yeah. Especially by members of the Executive Committee.
And then if we go to HCDO 40524, now these are the minutes of a meeting that the Society wouldn't have attended. It's the AIDS group of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation. This is a meeting on the 1st of October 1985. If we go, please, to page 6. And we look at paragraph 7, information exchange, you'll see this item at little 3. The content of the Haemophilia Society's Hemophilia sheets was discussed, and it was not thought to be of a high standard or very useful. It was agreed that the chairman would approach the Society to see if the quality of the sheets and the facts given in them could be better. Do you recall any approach from either the chair, who was Dr. Forbes at this point, or from UK HCDO more generally about the content of the Hemofacts?
I've no independent recall of it. And the thought that occurs to me now, of course, is it was the height of cheek to talk like that behind our backs when they were constantly saying, oh, the Haemophilia Society tells you all you need to know, just read the Hemofact sheets and things like that, as if we were the ultimate authority, whereas in fact it was them who was the ultimate authority, and it was they indeed who authored most of the sheets.
Well, that leads to the next question I wanted to ask you about very neatly, Mr. Waters, and I'm going to pick it up from your statement. Show me, could we have WITN 3429001, please? And if we could go to page 38. And if we look at paragraph 87, you say this: I'm aware that a number of clinicians have provided evidence to the inquiry in respect of what information they provided to their patients regarding the risks associated with blood products. A number of clinicians have stated that in addition to any information they provided, the patients had information disseminated by the Society. Whilst it is accepted that the Society posted copies of its publications to most of the centres, it was never the intention that this information would replace the medical advice of the clinicians. And then you refer to a paragraph in some of the Hemofacts. So obviously that's your reflection, having heard some of the evidence that the inquiry has heard.
Yes.
Looking back to the 80s, did the Society, as far as you can recall, ever think that a doctor's responsibility to advise or inform their patients had somehow been devolved to the Society in whole or part?
Indeed. Well, the responsibility clearly lay with the physicians, and we made that clear, especially in the Hemofact publications, which were highly sensitive.
So is this right? The Society, in publishing this material, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I want to check I'm correctly understanding your evidence, Mr. Waters, was not intending in any sense to replace or take the place of the doctor advising the patient?
Absolutely.
The
final decision lies with you and your medical advisors. This advice must always be given priority over any general advice which we may give.
Would you accept, nonetheless, however, that as a matter of fact, some members may have relied upon the Haemophilia Society as an important source of information about treatment and risks and aids?
Yes, it always puzzled me that here we were struggling in a little ground floor office that would have been a 2-bedroom flat in Southeast 1. And people tend to think we were some massive tower block with staff running all over the place and sat back having lazy conversations, mulling through points, rather than being people under huge pressure. I used to think that their view of the Society was that we were Greenpeace or some other big organisation, in fact we were tiny, and certainly not equipped to replace the medical advice of clinicians. I may have strayed from answering your question.
No. Really, I suppose I wanted to understand absolutely what you say about the function of the clinicians. Just wanted to, I suppose, get an understanding of what the Society would have understood the purpose of and effect of its publications being. You presumably sent out bulletins and Hemofacts in the expectation that they might be read by your members and that members might find them informative. That was presumably the purpose in part.
That is almost the entire purpose. I I can let the inquiry know that Hemofact was described as the least read publication issued by the Haemophilia Society because it usually contained bad news.
Moving to 1986, and I'm just going to ask you about some of the Society's actions over the years that followed in the second half of the 80s. If we look at HCDO 4 zeros, 271_066. This is another meeting of the UK HCDO's AIDS group, so again, not a meeting at which the Society would have been present. 2nd of July 1986, and if we go to the second page, please. First paragraph, so top half of the page, you'll see there's reference there to a counselling day for Haemophilia Centre staff. And if you look about 7 lines down, it records the chair saying this: he received frequent complaints via the Haemophilia Society about apparently appallingly low standards of counselling at some centres. And then there's a further discussion about the counselling day, including involvement of possibly a lawyer in the process. It would appear from this that the Society was receiving complaints about what's described here, appallingly low standards of counselling at some centres. Can you recall that as a feature of the complaints that you were receiving and dealing with?
I've got no immediate recall of it. I think the counselling services were just on the point of being introduced then, but by the time grants filter through and appointments are made and things like that.
Okay. If we go to the next page, and we look at the bottom of the page, so there's an overall heading confidentiality, and then if we look at the bottom half of the page, I just wanted to ask you about 2 items which refer to the Haemophilia, to the Haemophilia Society. So looking at the very top of what you can see on screen, there's a reference to patients' access. That's I think Dr. Peter Jones, thought the patients had a right to know that their names and other personal details were held on a computer file. He thought that the fact that the Haemophilia Society's representatives had been present at the 1968 AGM of Haemophilia Centre Directors, when the use of computing facilities by the Secretariat in Oxford was discussed, and had agreed to patients' names being included in the file, might be regarded as authorisation on behalf of all the patients, but this would need to be confirmed by a legal expert. And then if we go to a little further down, you'll see a paragraph B. Legal advice should be taken to ascertain if the Haemophilia Society's agreement in 1968 to patients' names being entered into the Oxford Secretariat's national computer file was blanket approval on behalf of all patients. Now, whether or not the date of 1968 is correct, I don't know, but do you recall any issue ever being brought to your attention in 1986 or thereafter, when this issue was being discussed by UK HCDO, about the question of consent for data to be retained by Oxford?
I remember it vaguely, and this was part of the Professor Savage big fallout with the Centre Directors Organisation and why he would not submit his records.
Okay, but you don't have any particular recollection of it being suggested that somehow the Haemophilia Society had consented on patients' behalf to the retention of this?
It was certainly 1968 because nothing like that ever happened during my time. And the date 68 comes up twice in the same set of minutes, which would imply it wasn't a typo.
And then if we look at the very bottom of the page, it says, referring to a letter he'd received dated the 26th of June, the chairman said that the Haemophilia Society were more concerned about the, top of the next page, confidentiality of patients' notes at centres than they were about data held in the Oxford computer. And again, I don't want to have to go through lots of different correspondence, but do you recall your members raising with you concerns about the confidentiality of their notes? I mean, we're now mid-1986. It's been flagged up as in an earlier Hemofact. Do you recall this being a continuing problem about medical confidentiality in centres?
It was certainly a concern. And if we continue to read the minutes, we see that participants in a Milan WFH conference were able to identify patients who were being referred to because their initials were used as the reference point. There were other things like the colour of sticker on your file to indicate whether you had HIV and AIDS and things like that, which was kind of open to public interpretation within the hospital.
And then if we could go to WITN 3429021. This is an exhibit to your witness statement. Can we go to the next page? It should be the minutes of a council meeting. We keep going. Yep, so we can see there it's minutes of the meeting of the Council of the Haemophilia Society on the 14th of March 1987. And if we could go to the next page, please, Shomik. Sorry, maybe the third page. Give me. No, back a page, I'm sorry. Top of that page. So we're now March 1987, and we've seen issues of confidentiality being flagged 85, 86. Questions were also raised concerning confidentiality of HIV test results and the reactions of some doctors, GPs and dentists to all patients with positive antibody test results. It was stressed that all instances of questionable practice by healthcare professionals should be reported directly and urgently in writing to the General Secretary. Now, it sounds from this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Waters, as though now by the spring of 1987, issues of confidentiality are a continuing concern being brought to the Society's attention, and some doctors and dentists reacting adversely to patients with positive test results. Can you recall any more detail about that? Or
I know that dentists always treated people with haemophilia and HIV at the end of the day, but I think time has shown that that was practice with anyone who is HIV positive. I think there was much more concern about confidentiality in centres, as I recall it, than with individual doctors and dentists. Although my memory is prompted, and I think there are instances where I remember GPs and dentists just refusing to treat people with haemophilia and HIV.
And can you recall what, if any, process the Society set up to deal with that? So we can see here there's a recommendation, a strong recommendation, it was stressed, that any examples should be reported directly and urgently to you. What was the expectation on you as to what you would then do with that information?
I would take it and raise it with the appropriate authorities, I guess. By this time, I noticed we've moved to Westminster Bridge Road. I did have more staff available to help with things like this.
Then there's one further document I want to ask you to look at, moving forward to 1990 now. Chomik, it's WITN 3429 030. Go to the next page. Next one. If we look at the top of the page, Mr. Waters, you'll see these are the minutes of the Medical Advisory Panel meeting 27th of April 1990 at the Kennedy Hotel. Lists those present. And then there's a discussion about blood products over the page. Discussion about a range of different matters. I want to ask you about something on the next page. So it's paragraph 7D. You just go down a little, please, Shemek. That's it. So under any other business, we have this. The problems over hepatitis C were raised. A number of people are known to be hepatitis C positive from blood tested from stored samples. This brought up the old ethical dilemma of how to inform people of a test result that they have not asked for. Now, you referred to that earlier, Mr. Waters, in the context of what the Society was hearing in the mid-80s in relation to HIV.
Yes.
It would seem from this that the same issue was repeating itself now in 1990 in relation to hepatitis C testing and people being tested without being told. Was that the Society's understanding?
Yes.
And do you know what, if any, steps the Society took? And obviously it's here being flagged up in the MAP meeting, but can you recall whether the Society took any steps in particular in response to that?
I can't remember distinctly, but I've got vague recollections of some actions following from that, because it's still alive in my memory as a kind of issue that we dealt with.
I want to ask you next, Mr. Waters, about the Society's involvement in issues relating to litigation and campaigning for compensation. I'm going to be inevitably selective in the documents I go to because there's a large number of documents which refer to that, and your statements described to some extent the Society's involvement in campaigning for compensation. So there's just a number of documents I want to ask for your observations on. The first is HSOC 0023234. If we go to the 5th page, please, of this. You can see there, it's a letter from you to the National Haemophilia Foundation in the States. We can't see the full date, but it's... I'm sorry. So I'm told this letter needs to come down. Can we take that down? Maybe an issue with redactions. Will you give me a moment, please, Mr. Waters? That's the one I was looking at.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's fine. Okay. But it's got his signature on it. Oh, no, it's not forwarded.
I think we're all right. Sorry, it's a page that we're not going to look at, so that may be a cause for concern. So if we look at HSOC 0023234 again, and go back to the 5th page. So we can see, if we just look at the text of the letter, if we zoom in on Dear Mr. Carman, so we go down further down, you can see here, and I can tell you this is, I think, October 85 that you're writing. We are at the moment investigating the possibility of taking legal action against someone in relation to AIDS and haemophilia, whilst it's perhaps the case that our best course of action would be against those persons supplied non-heat-treated concentrates after heat-treated concentrates became available, an HTLV3 seroconversion and development of AIDS had subsequently occurred, we're also interested in pursuing a case against our own National Blood Transfusion Service. It would be very helpful to us if we could know of any actions being taken by the National Haemophilia Foundation in the United States or indeed by individuals. Now, the response you got, and just in case there's a problem with the document, I'm not going to show you the response, but the response was the National Haemophilia Foundation's not initiating any legal action. Could we go to the third page of this document? I just want to ask you about the letter you then wrote back. So this is the 14th of January 1986. You've received a letter saying that there wasn't any action being undertaken by the National Haemophilia Federation. And you say this in the second paragraph: I'm grateful to you for this information, which will be most useful in killing a rising tide in opinion in the UK. Wanted to ask you if you can assist us with what you meant in that second paragraph.
I've got absolutely no idea. There were several rising tides of opinion around at that time.
Okay, all right. Well, if you can't assist us any further, obviously, then you can't. If we then go to HSOC 0029476058. We can see it's an executive committee meeting on the 1st of March 86. We just need to look at the last paragraph on this page, please. You'll see there under the heading compensation, the chair reported that further steps have been taken in connection with pursuing the question of compensation for those who'd come into contact with HTLV3 virus. The executive committee noted that action against pharmaceutical companies had been abandoned in the USA by the National Haemophilia Foundation. The executive committee agreed unanimously that the matter of compensation should be pursued on an urgent basis. The importance of not raising the expectations of members was stressed, since the issue could take years to resolve with no guarantee of the outcome. Now, I really wanted to ask you, using this as a springboard, Mr. Waters, to provide us with an overview of the steps that the Haemophilia Society took following the decision here by the Executive Committee to pursue the matter of compensation on an urgent basis. The steps the Haemophilia Society took in pursuit of that objective. What can you tell us about the steps taken?
I mean, I can tell you very little in detail that would not be available in a huge amount of documents. But we first of all, I think this was about the time that Simon Taylor became a member of the executive committee, and his speciality was in public relations and crisis management. We also very soon after that obtained the pro bono services of GJW Government Relations. And we fostered our relationships and links with the press and the media. In particular, Andrew Veitch at The Guardian and the Sunday Times came forward and dedicated 2 reporters to our campaigns. However, which time frames they fell into has gone from my memory.
If we look, I'll just.
And we motivated members to write to their MPs on the issue and up the profile at that level, as well as putting pressure on the Department of Health through meetings with ministers and things. I recall a meeting with John Moore, whose wife I knew in another connection, and I remember his opening words were, "It's so good to meet you, Mr. Waters. You ruin my breakfast every morning when my wife tells me what I should and should not be doing in relation to your campaign." But it was at that meeting that we were suddenly confronted with the question, well, how many people are involved in this, just so that they could get a grasp on the numbers. And we had not had time to deal with this question, right, of trying to evaluate the exact number of people. And this was in relation to HIV, and Alan Tanner and I agreed it would be in the region of 1,200 people. But, you know, my memory has big gaps in it.
We can take that document down. But before I show you a few further documents and ask for your comment on them, you've referred in your statement, I think, to meeting ministers to discuss, or MPs to discuss issues of compensation on a number of occasions. You've touched then on meeting with John Moore. And I think your statement refers to meetings with Kenneth Clark and with Edwina Curry. Can you recall any more detail about either of those?
Well, when we met Edwina Curry, it was to receive the first cheque for £10 million. And the most memorable thing about that was that the Paymaster General's cheque wasn't big enough for £10 million to be written in numbers. The bank manager also received me very warmly that day, I remember, when I went to pay it in. Meeting with Kenneth Clark. Yes, we went to, Father Tanner and I went to a meeting with Kenneth Clark, and we were ushered into his very comfortable office where he had 2 cigars going at the same time. I'm a great fan of Kenneth Clark, I have to say, possibly because we both like jazz. But Father Tanner, as we sat down, said, Mr. Clark, it's very, very kind of you to make time available to meet us to discuss the situation. And Kenneth Clark said, discuss the situation? I've invited you here to tell you how it's going to be, not for any discussion. It kind of put us back in our corner.
And just to try and assist with understanding that a little further, was that when Kenneth Clark was Secretary of State for Health?
Yes.
And
yes.
was that during the course of the HIV litigation, as far as you recall?
It was.
And can you recall anything further about that discussion and that meeting?
No. I mean, we also met with many others, MPs like Roger Gale, Peter Bottomley, Tony Newton. Tony Newton had a patient in his constituency which alerted his interest. But of course, in all those things, we were very reliant on members in their own constituencies writing to their MP, and we provided model letters and things like that.
Just going back, and I'm going to ask you just to look at a handful of documents in chronological order, just to try and pick up on some of the issues that arose. If we go to HCDO 40-276_033.
I take it I've seen all those documents already.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is the annual report from 1986, and if we go to page 8, we can see from the top of the page, it says it's clear from the advice we've received from Council that there's no case that the Society can pursue on behalf of our members either corporately or individually. As each individual's circumstances are different, it would be necessary for them to discuss their particular position with the solicitor before it can be established whether it's worth pursuing such an action through the courts. While we sought this advice generally and not based on any particular set of personal circumstances, we have to say that on present known facts and upon our judgment of the advice we've received, the prospect of the majority of claims succeeding is remote. There are 2 important reasons for this: the difficulty of proving negligence and the difficulty of identifying the proper body or person from whom compensation might be sought. Now, the purpose of showing you that at this stage, Mr. Waters, is just to understand that, is this right, in the course of 1986, is this correct? The Society sought advice from Council about whether the Society, could bring a legal claim, and the advice it received was that it would be unlikely to be able to do so. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If we then go to...
I think it's important to note the paragraph that follows as well, where we're continuing to present to the government the very special needs of people with haemophilia.
Yes, and I'm going to pick that up.
Yeah,
and I'm going to pick that up in the very next document, just to understand what it was the Society was saying about the publicly into government about the issues of compensation. If we go to HCDO 40-279_025, this is Hemofact 13 from May of 1987. And if we go over to the second page, it says at the top, members of the Society have asked for a statement of the Society's position regarding compensation for people with haemophilia who become HIV positive as a result of receiving contaminated blood products. And we can see there the Society's position was that people with haemophilia who are HIV positive deserve special financial support from the government. And then you refer in the next paragraph to the government having a clear moral duty to provide recompense. And you make the observation about the extent of the problem would have been considerably reduced if successive governments had honoured their pledges to make the UK self-sufficient and if steps had been taken sooner to screen donations and heat treat products. And then you go over 2 paragraphs further down, we're now able to give more details of how we can pursue our claim against the government. And if we look at the next move down the bottom of the page, seeing the Society sets out the various steps it's going to take, persuading the government to pay a special financial benefit. The Society will be holding a meeting with MPs, will then formally call upon the government to pay a special weekly benefit, and further detail is there provided. And we go to the next page. There's a paragraph at the top, winning support, and that talks about Simon Taylor and Dr. Peter Jones appearing on television programmes calling for action from the government, and it refers to there being essentially a media campaign and political campaign rallying MPs. And then under the next heading, we need your help, it asks for members to write to the Society in confidence so that hard evidence can be presented. This is obviously a description of the position as at 1987, but does this broadly accurately describe the decision and steps that the Society had decided to undertake to try and secure compensation from the government?
correct. And we were immediately discouraged from using the word compensation and instead using the word recompense, because compensation would imply liability.
If we then look at HSOC 303459, HSOC 303459. You'll see there, Mr. Waters, it's a document, AIDS, Haemophilia and the Government, a submission from the Haemophilia Society calling for financial provision for people with haemophilia infected with the AIDS virus, October 1987. And if we go over the page, we can see AIDS, Haemophilia and the Government summary. I want to pick it up in the third and fourth and fifth paragraphs. It says this: we're asking the government to help restore the quality of life of people with haemophilia and HIV infection. At government's suggestion, the Society has already explored the question of redress through the legal system and has been advised that claims for compensation as such are most unlikely to succeed because of the difficulty of proving negligence. In any case, the Society is advised that any solution which may be provided by the courts will not be available in the short term. However, the needs of families are immediate. The Society is therefore looking to government as the only available source of support, recognition and recompense. Well, there are two questions I wanted to ask you about that, Mr. Waters. The first is, appears to say that it was the government which suggested that the society explore the question of legal redress. Is that right? And if so, who in government proposed it?
I would have no recall.
Second point is that this is a document that is addressed to the government. The next page is called Submission to the Government.
Yeah.
And yet you are here telling the government of the society's advice that claims are most unlikely to succeed. It might be thought that's not the best negotiating tactic in the world, Mr. Waters. Can you recall why the society decided to share the outcome of its legal advice with the government?
I think we did. This is, my thought today, looking at it. It wasn't necessarily the fact on the day itself. I think we did it to increase the urgency of the situation for some kind of settlement to help with the predicament that we were finding individuals and families in. I mean, elsewhere you'll see that the society had expended £23,000 of its own money prior to anything else becoming available, and that in those days was absolutely unsustainable as an ongoing process to help people with their immediate financial problems.
If we go to HSOC 0023111, HSOC 0023111. You'll see here, Mr. Waters, it's a letter. I don't think this one is dated, but there's a letter to Dr. Arenstam, which we'll look at in a moment, which is dated January 1987. In any event, this is to Professor Bloom. Dear Arthur, in strictest confidence, I enclose a copy of the provisional opinion which we've received from the barrister involved in looking at the legal case for compensation in respect of people with haemophilia. I also enclose a short commentary on that which I've extracted. It's essential you regard both documents in the very strictest confidence and do not discuss them with anyone apart from the named recipients who appear at the end of this letter. And we can see the named recipients are Dr. Arenstam, Dr. Ritzer, Dr. Colvin and Dr. Forbes. And if we go over the page, we can see a letter in similar terms, not identical, dated the 29th of January 87 from you to Dr. Arenstam, again enclosing a copy of the provisional opinion and your commentary. You say you're sending the documents to him in particular since he's involved in some capacity with the Merseyside case. And again, you ask for it not to be discussed with anyone other than the recipients of the letter. Now, why was it that the society decided to share its opinion, which suggested that litigation would not be easy to achieve, with members of the medical advisory panel, or with the specific clinicians named here, I should say?
I've got no recall at all.
Was the society aware that some clinicians, it was clearly aware of Dr. Arenstam's involvement, but that some clinicians were involved in the course of the 80s as either directly because their regional health authority was being sued, or indirectly as experts for the defendants in the litigation, or that might happen?
We may well have been aware of that, yes.
Because it might be thought somewhat odd that a society representing individual members trying to do its best to get compensation or recompense for individual members would share its negative advice about the prospects of litigation with those who might, as it were, end up being on the other side of that litigation. Do you have any comments on that?
With hindsight, that's particularly accurate point.
but not something that you thought about at the time. If we then go to HCDO 40-276_047, please. So this is a Haemophilia Society publication update, June 1989. So I've moved on towards the end of the 1980s. And if we can look at the article headed compensation questions, it says there, later in the year, the Society will be launching a new campaign designed to achieve an out-of-court settlement of compensation from the government. This announcement was made by the General Secretary, that's you, on Newsnight on the 6th of June 1989. The Society is no stranger to campaigning on issues affecting people with haemophilia. In November 87, the Society led a campaign resulting in the establishment of the Macfarlane Trust, funded by the government with a grant of £10 million. This fund is unique not only in the UK but the whole of Europe. At the same time, we investigated the legal position of claims for compensation. Our advice at that time had to be that cases should proceed on an individual basis. Some 250 individuals have started actions during the last 2 years. The Society has now reviewed the situation, and it's our belief that the government must recognise the need for compensation now rather than in 5 to 10 years' time. And then if we look at the bottom of that column, what should do now? We believe that infection through medicinal products is one which both demands and deserves compensation. There is strength in numbers, and it's therefore important that everyone who's considering a claim should register this intention by consulting a lawyer. We can let you have the name and address of the lawyer nearest to you. So I just want to understand the chronology that emerges from the documents, Mr. Waters, and you can tell me, please, if I'm wrong. The first compensation or recompense campaign that we looked at a few minutes ago resulted in, or perhaps came to an end when the government provided the £10 million fund that was provided to the Society and led to the initial establishment of the Macfarlane Trust. Is this right, that by 1989 the Society has formed the view that that's not enough, and it's now, as it were, voicing support for the individual litigation that had been brought by a number of patients? Is that broadly accurate?
Indeed, but my recall is that the pursuit of litigation was somehow orchestrated by us. It was certainly aided and facilitated by us through knowing experienced lawyers in similar cases around the country and things like that.
Okay. Yeah. And then there are two specific documents I want to see whether you can assist us in understanding more. HSOC 0023179. This is a fax from your secretary to Tony Mallon. It says, David asked me to let you know that you may receive a telephone call from a doctor wishing to remain anonymous. He says his vital information would not tell us but wanted to speak to lawyers involved, would be prepared to speak at hearing. He said his element of surprise would be important. If the DHSS knew what he's prepared to say, they would take evasive action. And that's being drawn to the attention of one of the solicitors involved. Do you recall anything further about this, or what the information was?
I recall the information. We got many strange calls, I have to say, at that time. And this was just alerting a particular lawyer to the fact of one call. But
can you assist us with what the information was that this unnamed doctor was proposing to share?
I think the unnamed doctor, if he existed, never actually made the phone call.
All right, then I can't ask anything more about that. And then I want to ask you about a document that you've been provided with in the course of the week. It's PJON 3 zeros. No, sorry, I think that might be 4 zeros. 134_001.
I know the document. I've read it so many times.
I would just wait. I might have given the wrong reference, but I'm hoping not. Do you still have the Newcastle documents on? If you go into the Newcastle documents, Shomek, we looked at it last week.
You looked at it on Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, PJON. I think it's 4 zeros, 134_001. Great. So it should come up in a moment, I hope. So I know you've seen this document, Mr. Waters, this week. I think for the first time. Is that right?
For the first time, yes.
It's entitled "Meeting with David Waters, 13th of June 1989," and says this: everything points to some central government secret, possibly in the late 70s, early 1980s, involving members of the cabinet. The solicitors acting on behalf of the haemophiliacs are going for disclosure of government records assumed to be within the Committee on Safety of Medicines in the hope they'll embarrass government to give an out-of-court settlement. And then it refers to remarks made by David, and the document would suggest that that's referring to you, suggests that present members of the cabinet are vulnerable. It refers to a civil servant working for Norman Fowler, having let it be known to David, so I'm assuming again that's you, that it's considered within the department that government is vulnerable and an out-of-court settlement should be made. A similar message given at the meeting at the Ministry by Tony Newton. Just pausing there. Do you have any recollection of the meeting to which this apparently relates?
No, and I'm even more puzzled to know who the author was, because at one time it's saying I this, I that, I the next thing, and then it's referring to we. We suspect Scottish blood transfusion. So, I don't recall an interview going along those lines. And I think I would have remembered it because I would have considered a leaking civil servant in Norman Fowler's office a real gift from God in the situation we were in. I've got no recall of that at all.
So this is a document provided to the inquiry by Dr. Peter Jones. It's not clear from the document if it's a document written by Dr. Jones or not, but that's how the inquiry has obtained it. You did, I think, work quite closely with Dr. Peter Jones in the second half of the 80s on the campaign.
Yes.
Do you recall a meeting with either Dr. Jones or anyone else at which a discussion along these lines took place?
No.
And then if we just pick up some of the individual points, the first is the one I think you've already commented on. Civil servant working for Norman Fowler. Do you have any recollection of being told by a civil servant working for Norman Fowler the government's inside views?
I do not, but if that had actually happened, it was the sort of thing that would stick in one's mind forever, because it would have been a real gift.
And then it refers to a similar message being given at a meeting at the Ministry by Tony Newton, and you've referred to meetings with Mr. Newton. Do you recall anything about meetings with Mr. Newton which, as it were, suggested or hinted at the government being enthusiastic for an out-of-court settlement?
Not at all.
The document then continues, we know, and you're right, Mr. Waters, it doesn't clearly show who the we are, but did you know or understand the decision about the 10 million payout to have been taken by Mrs. Thatcher on the afternoon a question was raised in the House? Was that something you understood to be the position at the time?
Rings no bells at all.
And then do you recall any meeting or discussions which shared information along the lines set out in what follows about the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service?
Again, it rings absolutely no bells and sounds to me like a fiction.
Okay, if we go over the page, if we look at the second paragraph, it refers to Peter Bottomley having made initial moves towards Miss David Waters with regard to further financial help for haemophiliacs. Can you recall anything that might fall within that description? Mr. Bottomley approaching you?
We approached every MP in the House, and most of them, well, not most of them, but a handful of them responded and made approaches to us and made signs that they were willing to be helpful. And Roger Gale springs particularly to mind. Peter Bottomley doesn't spring so readily to mind.
All right. Okay, thank you. And those were the questions I wanted to ask you about the document. Were there any other observations?
I did have another concern, because when I received this document, there were other papers attached to it that indicated it may have been associated somehow with Armour Pharmaceutical. And Oleander Project was mentioned, or something like that.
Yes, I think that's just the form in which the inquiry has received it.
Yeah, that raised some disturbing questions in my mind.
So that nobody is under any misapprehension as to what you're talking about, can you go to the next page, please, Seamus? Is that what you're referring to?
That's what I'm referring to, yes.
Yes, I mean, that's the form in which the inquiry has the document, so that's why you've received it in that form.
The comment down the bottom is the one that concerned me.
Okay. Was there any other observation you had on what purports to be some form of record or account of a meeting with you, or prepared for a meeting with you?
Well, when I first read it, I thought this is a work of fiction, and I kind of remain of that persuasion.
Okay.
And it almost suggests tidbits of gossip rather than an actual interview.
Can I ask you to look next at just a handful of further documents relating to the issue of compensation and campaigning. If we could go to RFLT 606, please. Sorry, Seamus, I think I've given you the wrong reference. RFLT 604. This is a letter from you dated the 24th of October 1990. It's an urgent letter to all society members from the General Secretary. It refers in the first paragraph to media speculation about the possibility of an out-of-court settlement. In the second paragraph, you say it's being implied that negotiations are taking place between lawyers representing both sides, i.e. your lawyers and the government lawyers, to establish an acceptable out-of-court settlement. The Haemophilia Society is not and cannot be involved in those negotiations. If they're taking place, they're being held between the lawyers. And then the next paragraph refers to settlement figures reported in the press being speculative. And then you say this: the role of the society throughout has been to make it politically expedient for the government to settle our case out of court now rather than in 3 or 4 years' time. The other point, of course, is that money paid out now is guaranteed, whereas there are certainly no guarantees associated with the final outcome of the legal case. What was the purpose of writing this letter, and what in particular did you mean by the Society's role being to make it politically expedient for the government to settle the case out of court?
I'm finding it very difficult to recall, right? I remember the letter. And political expediency was always something that we had on our map, because it's political expediency that makes governments move in things. And settling out of court, I may as well have said now rather than in 34 years' time, because that's where we are today, and there has still been no real settlement, no meaningful settlement by government.
Can I ask you about 2 further documents then around this time, and that will may after that be the right moment to break. The first is DHSC 302536_061. Now this is an internal departmental document. It's the previous year, so it's November 1989. And this refers to, it says the author, so if we just go down the page so we can see the author, is a Tracy Farr, and it says, I've today received a telephone call from David Waters of the Haemophilia Society, in which he states that having again consulted with their lawyers, the sum of £86 million, on average around £71,000 a case, would be required to bring legal action to an end. Now that seems somewhat at odds with what's set out a year later in the letter to members, which is saying the Society can't get involved in negotiations. This records you telephoning the Department of Health to, as it were, set out a settlement figure. Can you recall your involvement and why you might be contacting the Department of Health in that way?
None at all. I knew Strawn Heppel. He was a senior civil servant involved in the establishment of the McFarlane Trust. But even if then I had any right to make such a statement, I've got no recall of having made it. It's the sort of thing one wouldn't do in a telephone call.
One further document on the theme of the Society's involvement in negotiations is HSOC 0017272. I should say this is a letter from, if we go to the second page first of all, just to see who it's from. It's from, not from you, it's from the Vice Chair of the Society. We go back to the first page. It's the 3rd of November 1990, and it's written to William Waldegrave, who has taken over as Secretary of State for Health. And we can see from the first paragraph that's a new appointment. And then in the next paragraph it says, I want to take this opportunity to correct some false impressions which appear to be present within the thinking of the department in relation to people with haemophilia and HIV who are seeking compensation. The most serious of those relates to the fact that it's been alleged from within the department that the Haemophilia Society has named an acceptable sum for an out-of-court settlement. This is not the case. Our position is very simply this: we have not, nor do we intend to, put forward a settlement figure. Proposals of this nature are entirely for the lawyers acting for those plaintiffs who are pursuing a claim for legal compensation. It must also be pointed out that those who are pursuing this course are doing so at the behest of the government, who've again and again insisted that this was the only course available to those seeking compensation. Those who've chosen this route have done so because of government policy. Then it goes on in the next paragraph to say it's been open to the government since 1986 to settle this matter in an open-handed manner without the need for litigation. The matter only became one of public and political interest because of the piecemeal fashion in which the government has chosen to deal with it. Contrary to the view which has been expressed by the department in recent weeks, I would want to quietly remind you that the payments which have so far been made to the McFarlane Trusts have only been made as a result of very hard campaigning by ourselves. This in turn generated widespread political and public support. It's also surprising that in recent weeks those ex gratia payments have suddenly become payments made from a sense of moral responsibility. We believe there's a great deal to be gained on both sides by an out-of-court settlement, not least for people with haemophilia themselves. They are currently dying at the rate of at least one a week, and that of itself is a telling factor about the overall urgency of our unique situation. However, more importantly for you and for the department, it would mean that a settlement could be made without any admission of liability for negligence. It's also, in our view, most unfair the department should continue to make direct comparisons between people with cancers, heart conditions, renal failures, etc., and people with haemophilia and HIV. None of those people acquired their condition as a result of treatment prescribed by the NHS. It is this fact which makes the position of our affected members so tragically unique. We're deeply concerned that there now appears to be little or no negotiating taking place between yourselves and the plaintiffs' lawyers. So if we can just go back to the first page. That first main paragraph beginning "I also want" is describing what's said to be the Haemophilia Society's role, so not its role to participate in the negotiations or put forward settlement figures. Was that your understanding of the Society's role at the time?
Yes. That's why I'm quite puzzled by the previous note that was circulated internally that I'd never, well, had I seen it before? I don't know. I certainly hadn't seen it until this inquiry.
And then the second theme, as it were, emerging from this letter is, and I paraphrase, a sense of concern or frustration that the government is not making sufficient attempts to address what the Society saw as an injustice. Can you recall that being the Society's view? Was it frustrated and concerned about the government's stance? And if so, can you just give us any details you can recall?
I mean, we were deeply frustrated because the grant of £10 million, which was a reasonable sum of money. I think in those days it would have bought a 737 airliner or something. It was really a cynical attempt by the government to dismiss us and put us off the scent for all time. And I'm very proud of the fact that that was not the case. We did not accept a £10 million one-off payment as being something that would meet the needs for all time of people who were so sadly impacted upon by this dreadful disease.
And do you recall anything further? In particular, we're now at the end of 1990. Do you recall anything further about the interactions that the Society had with government at the time? You've told us about a meeting with Ken Clark. Do you recall, for example, any meetings with Mr. Waldegrave as Secretary of State for Health?
I cannot recall. Okay. I can't recall in detail any further meetings. I would need prompting with documentation.
Fine. Sir, I note we're now just past 1 o'clock. I've still got some topics to cover with Mr. Waters, and of course we need the opportunity for recognised legal representatives of core participants to put forward further questions. So would this be a convenient point to end for today and pick up again at 10 o'clock tomorrow?
Yes, it would. Subject just to one matter. Can we go back to the document we were looking at before this, which is DHSC 302536_061? And do we happen to have or know what is in Mr. Heppel's minute of 10th November 1989, which is referenced there, paragraph 2?
So we certainly don't have it to hand now. It may be that we can locate it for tomorrow.
Yes, I think it might be interesting to see what that is, because it may help to prompt Mr. Waters' recollection, if he has one. It might, for instance, be that this is not a case of Mr. Waters phoning up and saying, by the way, we'll take 86 million, but Mr. Heppel saying, you've got close connections with those who are carrying out the litigation. Can you give me, you're looking for a settlement, can you give me any idea about what they're looking for? Something along those lines. I don't know. But it may be that the minute helps.
I'll see if we can find it for tomorrow, and of course, if we do, we'll provide a copy to Mr. Waters.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, on that note, let's take a break then until 10 o'clock tomorrow, Mr. Waters.
Could I just check that we will finish tomorrow?
That's certainly my expectation, Mr. Waters, in terms of the questions I have for you, and those further questions I anticipate receiving from recognised legal representatives should fit within the course of tomorrow morning.
It's certainly my intention that we should, Mr. Waters.
Thank you.